Good evening, my friend. Tonight, we step once more into the quiet corners of history, searching for the moments that shaped our world in forgotten ways. I'm so glad you're here, sharing this peaceful time. Whether you're wrapped in the comfort of your blankets or simply closing your eyes to listen, I invite you to join me on this gentle journey. Where are you in the world right now? What time is it in your corner of the night? Are you just waking up to a new day, or are you about to drift off with the whispers of the past in your ear? If you find yourself moved by these tranquil passages through time, remember to subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead, and I hope we can share them together. Dear listeners, we are about to begin a historical journey into a forgotten era, a time when an entire generation of artists, writers, and thinkers were captivated by a new substance that promised to unlock the most profound depths of their creative potential. The price of this fleeting inspiration, however, would be a national tragedy of staggering proportions. The late 19th century in France, a period known as the Belle Époque, or the Beautiful Era, was a time of unprecedented artistic, cultural, and technological change. It was a golden age defined by optimism, innovation, and a vibrant intellectual life that saw the flourishing of Impressionism, Symbolism, and a host of other revolutionary movements. As the undisputed cultural capital of the world, Paris served as a magnet for brilliant minds from every corner of the globe, painters, poets, composers, and philosophers who were eager to push the boundaries of human expression. Amid this flourishing environment, a peculiar green liquor, absinthe, began its inexorable rise to become not merely a beverage, but a cultural phenomenon, a key to a new realm of consciousness that artists believed was essential to their work. Its popularity was fueled by an alluring mystique, the idea that it was more than just a drink. It was a conduit for experiencing the world in a new, more profound way. The ritual of preparing absinthe was as captivating as its effects, turning a simple act of drinking into an elaborate ceremony. The process began with a delicate, often ornate, absinthe fountain, its reservoir filled with ice-cold water. A small, perforated spoon, often crafted with an intricate design of a leaf or a geometric pattern, was placed over the rim of a thick-bottomed absinthe glass. On this spoon, a single sugar cube was carefully placed. The fountain spigot was then opened, allowing a thin, steady stream of water to slowly drip onto the sugar cube. As the water dissolved the sugar, it mixed with the absinthe, which would magically transform from a clear, brilliant green to a milky, swirling, and opaque pale green, a visual spectacle known as the louche. This slow, careful ritual was not about efficiency. It was about anticipation, a meditative act that served as a prelude to the intoxication. The sheer number of absinthe fountains, spoons, and specially designed glassware created a thriving sub-economy in Paris, with master artisans creating some of the most beautiful drinking accoutrements of the era. By the 1890s, the absinthe craze had reached its zenith. Parisians were consuming a staggering 36 million liters of the substance annually. Every day, as the clock in Paris struck 5, the city entered l'heure verte, or the green hour, and cafes would fill with a distinctive aromatic haze of anise, fennel, and other botanicals. This was not a quick drink. It was an event, a time for intellectual debate, artistic collaboration, and a collective state of mind. The appeal of absinthe was particularly strong among the artistic elite. Painters like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec and Edgar Degas, and poets such as Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud, all embraced the green fairy. They were convinced that absinthe was more than a recreational indulgence. It was a necessary tool for accessing a deeper truth. Writers claimed it unlocked new vocabulary and narrative structures. Painters saw new dimensions in color and light, and musicians found melodies flowing from their subconscious without effort. Oscar Wilde, a notable advocate during his time in Paris, famously described its effects in a way that captured its double-edged nature. After the first glass, you see things as you wish they were. After the second, you see things as they are not. Finally, you see things as they really are, which is the most horrible thing in the world. This was not merely a figure of speech. Absinthe had a profound and unique effect on the human mind that was distinct from the effects of simple alcohol. Unlike other spirits that simply dulled the senses, absinthe seemed to actively heighten them, creating a state where perceptions blended and boundaries dissolved. Users reported experiencing synesthesia, where they could hear colors or see sounds. This was not just a symptom of drunkenness. It was a fundamental shift in sensory perception that made it an ideal companion for the artistic process, particularly for the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists who were trying to capture subjective experience on canvas. The absinthe of this era was chemically distinct from modern versions. Its key ingredient, grand wormwood, contained a high concentration of thujone, a compound that directly impacts the brain's GABA receptors, which are responsible for regulating neural activity. This modulation of neural activity was what produced the hallucinatory and mind-altering effects. Research indicates that 19th century absinthe contained thujone levels 10 times higher than what is permitted in today's products, which are often produced as a novelty spirit with little to no actual psychoactive effects. However, thujone was only one piece of a complex botanical puzzle. Authentic absinthe was a finely balanced mixture of a dozen or more herbs, including fennel, anise, hyssop, lemon balm, and various others. Each ingredient contributed its own unique psychoactive properties, creating a powerful and synergistic combined effect. Master distillers of the time guarded their recipes as trade secrets, with the production process often resembling alchemy. The final product was also remarkably potent, typically between 68% and 72% alcohol by volume. It was the synergy between this high alcohol content and the mind-altering botanicals that created a new, profoundly different kind of intoxication, one that was sought after not for its inebriating qualities, but for its hallucinatory ones. Café culture in Paris was completely redefined by absinthe. Dozens of establishments became known as temples to the Green Fairy, each with its own specialized glassware, spoons, and water-dripping techniques. A unique subculture emerged with its own jargon, social norms, and even its own code of ethics. The absinthe ritual became a social performance, with skilled drinkers executing the preparation with practiced grace. Surprisingly, women played a significant role in this scene, using the drink as a means of social and creative liberation, challenging the restrictive gender roles of the period. The absinthe of the Belle Époque was not confined to a single social stratum. It was as popular among bohemian artists as it was among middle-class professionals and even working-class laborers. It was a social leveler, a common thread that ran through the fabric of Parisian society. The absinthe boom had a massive economic impact on Paris and France as a whole. Entire industries, from specialized glassware manufacturers to café furniture makers, flourished. The substance also redefined the rhythm of intellectual life. The green hour became a shared time of altered consciousness, fostering a new kind of artistic collaboration and dialogue that transcended traditional boundaries. Writers and philosophers would gather at cafes to discuss the nature of reality and consciousness, their conversations fueled by the hallucinatory effects of the drink. The output of this period was astonishing, but beneath the veneer of artistic brilliance, a darker truth was beginning to emerge. As the craze grew, the medical community was completely caught off guard. Doctors began documenting an alarming new set of symptoms among their patients: vivid, persistent hallucinations that lingered long after the alcohol had left their systems, followed by severe psychological breakdowns. Hospital records showed a sharp increase in admissions for absinthism, a distinct medical condition that combined the worst aspects of alcoholism with a new and bizarre form of mental decay. Patients exhibited extreme sensitivity to light and sound, suffered from persistent visual disturbances, and displayed thought patterns that swung wildly between moments of brilliant clarity and complete incoherence. Most disturbing, many appeared to have a permanent, fundamental change in their perception of reality. Doctors didn't yet understand the full extent of what they were seeing, but they were witnessing the first large-scale psychoactive drug crisis in modern history. Neurological analysis now suggests that chronic absinthe use was actively reshaping the brains of its users, causing lasting changes in how they processed information and constructed their reality. The most tragic examples were found in the era's most celebrated creative minds. Paul Verlaine, a brilliant poet, saw his mind systematically destroyed by years of heavy absinthe use. His medical records describe violent mood swings, persistent hallucinations, and total breaks from reality, eventually leading to his arrest for assaulting his former lover, Arthur Rimbaud. The public was horrified by the stories but captivated by the art. The case of Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec was equally disturbing. His dependency grew so extreme he modified his walking cane to carry absinthe with him at all times, a desperate measure that spoke to the depth of his addiction. His private letters show a mind constantly on the brink, alternating between profound artistic insight and psychological collapse. These public tragedies became a source of grim fascination for the French public, who were both horrified by the stories and captivated by the art that was being produced by these tortured geniuses. Despite the mounting evidence of its devastating effects, absinthe consumption continued to soar. Why would so many intelligent, well-adjusted people persist in using a substance that was clearly destroying them? The answer lay in its unique addictive properties. Absinthe didn't just create a physical craving, it created a deep psychological dependency. Users became convinced that their creative abilities were tied directly to the substance. Writers feared their words would lose their power, and painters worried their vision would fade if they abandoned the green fairy. The addiction was not just to the substance, but to the illusion of enhanced creativity it provided, a psychological trap that was far more difficult to escape than a simple physical craving. This deep-seated fear of losing their creative edge, combined with the immense social pressure to conform to absinthe culture, made it nearly impossible for many artists to quit until it was far too late. The psychological and cultural battle over absinthe was now in full swing, but it was being waged on multiple fronts simultaneously. The absinthe craze was fueled by more than just artistic fantasy. It was driven by the very real, short-term benefits that many users experienced. The thujone compounds in absinthe acted as a mild stimulant, while the high alcohol content dissolved inhibitions. This mix produced a mental state that was both relaxed and incredibly focused, allowing artists and writers to achieve creative breakthroughs that seemed impossible while sober. This perceived enhancement was so powerful that it created a deep psychological addiction, a profound fear of losing one's creative edge without the green fairy. The immense social pressure within Parisian creative circles made it even harder to stop. Absinthe was so central to the culture that abstaining was viewed as a sign of intellectual weakness, and artists who tried to quit were often ostracized. The French government's response was agonizingly slow, largely because of how deeply absinthe was intertwined with society. Early attempts at regulation were met with fierce resistance from the powerful alcohol industry, from cafe owners who saw their business models threatened, and even from some doctors who believed the drink was a vital part of France's cultural identity. However, a major turning point came in 1901 when the French Academy of Medicine commissioned a major study led by Dr. Valentine Magnin, a pioneering psychiatrist and neurologist. His research would eventually provide the definitive scientific evidence against absinthe. Magnin's experiments on animals were a breakthrough. He exposed them to absinthe and other spirits, documenting the resulting neurological and behavioral changes. His findings showed that absinthe caused brain lesions and bizarre, seizure-like behavioral changes that were distinct from those caused by pure alcohol. His findings were groundbreaking, suggesting that the botanical compounds in absinthe were directly neurotoxic and caused a unique form of neural damage. His most shocking discovery came from autopsies of deceased absinthe users, which revealed consistent brain damage in the frontal cortex, the area responsible for judgment and impulse control. This was not typical alcoholism. It was a unique form of neural decay caused by absinthe's specific chemical composition, a new kind of pathology for a new kind of substance. The international medical community was stunned. For the first time, there was hard scientific proof that absinthe was a unique and powerful neurotoxin that could cause permanent brain damage. The scientific evidence was building, but the cultural ties were far stronger. Absinthe had become a symbol of French identity, a key part of the romantic ideal of the suffering artist whose pain leads to great art. The debate over its future exposed deep rifts in French society. Conservative critics, often supported by the powerful wine lobby, argued that absinthe was a moral poison destroying the nation's character, turning hard-working citizens into delusional addicts. Its defenders, however, argued that it was a tool for liberation, an essential component for artists to break free from the constraints of ordinary life and reach new heights of creative expression. The wine industry, which saw absinthe as a direct competitor, funded a powerful and effective propaganda campaign that demonized the drink as a foreign and corrupting influence. They leveraged the moral outrage of the anti-alcohol movement, framing the debate not as one of economics, but of national identity. The economic arguments were equally powerful and complex. The absinthe industry employed tens of thousands of people, from distillers to bottle makers, and the tax revenue it generated was a significant source of government funding for public works and education. Cafe owners warned that a ban would ruin their businesses, as the long, ritualized consumption of absinthe brought in far more revenue than the simple sale of other drinks. Absinthe had become so synonymous with Parisian culture that a ban seemed like an act of self-sabotage, an abandonment of one of France's most potent cultural exports. The artistic community's reaction to the growing call for a ban was swift and intense. Artists published fiery manifestos, arguing that any prohibition was a form of government censorship. They formed absinthe defense societies and organized public protests, framing the debate as a fundamental struggle between artistic freedom and authoritarian control. Oscar Wilde, ever the iconoclast, became the most vocal defender of the pro-absinthe movement, framing the struggle as a part of humanity's eternal quest to transcend the limitations of normal consciousness. Yet, even as artists defended their right to drink, the evidence of its destructive power continued to mount. Hospital admissions for absinthism were rising, and the symptoms were becoming more severe and bizarre. Doctors documented cases that defied all previous medical understanding, with patients claiming they could see music as geometric patterns, or that colors had distinct personalities that spoke to them. One sculptor became convinced his hands were slowly melting away, while another painter began incorporating his hallucinations into his work, creating grotesque and bizarre images that were both captivating and disturbing. Medical journals from the period are filled with these stories. Dr. Auguste Mocherel published a study in 1902 detailing over 300 different symptoms. His patients described living in a state between reality and hallucination, seeing shadows move on their own and conversing with dead relatives. The unsettling consistency of these symptoms across all social classes, from laborers to aristocrats, confirmed that absinthe's core compounds were causing predictable neurological damage regardless of the user's background. The most thorough investigation came from Dr. Emil Kraepelin in Germany, a foundational figure in modern psychiatry. He found that absinthe produced a unique form of intoxication that combined heightened sensory perception with severely impaired judgment. Drinkers reported that colors appeared more vivid and sounds were crisper, but this came at a terrible cost. They lost the ability to perform basic logical tasks, and often engaged in dangerous and reckless behavior they would never have considered while sober. Kraepelin's research showed that absinthe's thujone compounds were binding to specific parts of the brain that controlled both sensory processing and rational thought. This created a neurological cascade that amplified perception while simultaneously destroying the very structures needed to interpret those perceptions rationally. This explained why absinthe users produced brilliant work early on but later descended into madness as the substance gradually destroyed the brain's ability to remain connected to reality. The French government was in a nearly impossible position. The scientific evidence was overwhelming, yet the cultural and economic forces supporting absinthe were just as powerful. Police departments were reporting a sharp increase in violent crimes committed by absinthe users. These were not typical brawls, but acts of extreme and bizarre brutality that suggested the perpetrators were in a completely altered state. One notorious case involved Vincent Carrel, a respected bank clerk, who, after consuming several glasses of absinthe, killed 3 families in his apartment building because he was convinced they were part of a secret conspiracy against him. The case made national headlines and became a rallying point for the anti-absinthe movement. Prohibitionists argued it proved absinthe turned ordinary people into violent lunatics. Defenders claimed he was already mentally unstable and that blaming the substance was like blaming wine for every crime. The scientific community itself was divided. Some doctors demanded an immediate ban based on evidence of neurotoxicity, while others argued that moderate use could be safe and that the real problem was unregulated, counterfeit absinthe. Lab tests confirmed that many commercial absinthes contained highly toxic industrial chemicals like copper sulfate for coloring and antimony chloride for the clouding effect. These fakes were often more dangerous than the real thing and caused symptoms that perfectly mimicked the worst effects of absinthism. This revelation complicated the debate. Prohibitionists argued that the widespread existence of these fakes proved the industry could never be safe. Industry supporters, however, argued that proper regulation could solve the problem and allow for the continued production of the genuine drink. Meanwhile, absinthe's cultural reach was expanding far beyond the artistic circles. Middle-class Parisians began adopting the rituals, seeing the ceremony as a mark of sophistication. Department stores sold absinthe service sets as wedding gifts, creating a new, much larger group of people who would oppose any ban. The international dimension of the crisis was also growing more important. Switzerland, the birthplace of absinthe, was the first country to completely ban it in 1910, following a horrific incident known as the Landfray murders. A farmer and heavy absinthe drinker named Jean Lanfray murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters during a psychotic episode induced by the drink. The case made headlines worldwide and gave a major boost to the anti-absinthe movement across Europe, leaving France as the final bastion of the Green Fairy. The international community's view of France began to shift dramatically as temperance movements in the United States and across Europe seized upon French absinthe consumption as a powerful symbol of European moral decay. British medical journals published sensational accounts of Parisian absinthism, framing them as cautionary tales of what happens when a society prioritizes artistic decadence over public health. The German government, in particular, used the crisis for political and cultural advantage. German tabloids and official government publications alike mocked the French as a nation of absinthe addicts, and Kaiser Wilhelm II's comments grew increasingly sharp, positioning German culture and morality as superior, with absinthe serving as the perfect symbol for everything he claimed was wrong with French society. These public humiliations were particularly galling to French nationalists, who saw their country's cultural achievements as central to its identity and global prestige. The notion that France was being mocked and sidelined because of a single psychoactive substance generated immense political pressure for the government to take decisive and immediate action. The Swiss ban on absinthe, a significant event in itself, created an intriguing real-world experiment. Switzerland, the birthplace of the spirit, completely banned it in 1910, following the horrific Lanfray murders. A farmer and heavy absinthe drinker named Jean Lanfray murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters during a psychotic episode induced by the drink. The case made headlines worldwide and gave a major boost to the anti-absinthe movement across Europe. In the wake of the ban, however, a flourishing smuggling trade immediately emerged, with French and Italian producers creating elaborate networks to supply Swiss users who refused to give up their drink. The black market absinthe was often far more dangerous than the legal kind, as smugglers used cheap, toxic ingredients. The Swiss experience showed that a national ban alone might be ineffective without broader, multi-country action and demonstrated the difficulty of policing a substance with such a deep-seated following. Meanwhile, the economic arguments against a ban became more complex. Industry-funded studies claimed that the absinthe business directly employed over 50,000 people and indirectly supported another 100,000 in related industries, from glassmaking to tourism. The tax revenue was substantial, funding many public projects. Cafe owners lobbied fiercely, arguing that the ritualized, slow consumption of absinthe brought in far more revenue than the simple sale of other drinks, and that a ban would dismantle the very foundation of Parisian intellectual life. The artistic community was still deeply conflicted. Many artists, while acknowledging the risks, argued that genuine creative work required a degree of risk and sacrifice. The romantic idea of the tortured artist, whose suffering produced transcendent beauty, was so ingrained in French culture that many feared a ban would stifle creativity. This fundamental philosophical tension between artistic freedom and social responsibility was at the heart of the debate, with no easy answers. The year 1905 marked a crucial turning point. A series of highly publicized incidents involving absinthe users began to sway public opinion, showing that the drink's dangers were not confined to the bohemian artistic class but could affect any respectable, middle-class professional. One of the most significant was the case of Marie Besnard, a respected schoolteacher who had been using absinthe to manage her nervous disorders. Her diary, discovered after her death, provided a chilling, first-person account of her mental decline. Her early entries spoke of the drink's benefits, describing how it helped her see the mathematical patterns in human behavior and hear the symphony of a bustling classroom. But as her consumption increased, the writing became increasingly paranoid and incomprehensible, filled with bizarre hallucinations she incorporated into her teaching. What was most disturbing was how long Besnard maintained her professional duties. When she finally collapsed, a doctor discovered she had been consuming almost 2 liters of absinthe a day. Her autopsy confirmed the same kind of specific brain damage that Dr. Magnan had identified earlier. The case was front-page news, showing that absinthe's dangers were not limited to bohemian artists but could affect any respectable, middle-class professional. In 1906, Dr. Marcel Bayen, a leading expert on absinthe, published a detailed analysis that revolutionized medical understanding of the crisis. He showed that absinthe dependency developed in 4 predictable stages. The first, enhancement, saw users experiencing real creative benefits and increased confidence. The second, distortion, was when reality began to subtly shift, but users saw this as a sign of expanded consciousness, not decay. The third, dissociation, involved complete breaks from reality, where users might believe they were traveling to other dimensions or conversing with the dead. The final stage, dissolution, was a total psychological collapse. This stage-based model explained why so many intelligent people continued using absinthe despite its clear dangers. Their brain damage was so gradual they couldn't see it happening, and the early, positive effects obscured the tragic outcome. The artistic community largely dismissed Bayen's findings as a crude, scientific explanation for genuine creative insight. Prominent figures like Paul Gauguin and Stéphane Mallarmé wrote extensively about how absinthe allowed them to perceive deeper realities. These testimonials had enormous cultural influence. However, Dr. Bryant and his colleagues countered that while absinthe might offer short-term benefits, they inevitably led to long-term psychological destruction. This crucial distinction between immediate benefits and long-term costs became a key part of the regulatory debate. The economic stakes continued to rise. The absinthe industry was one of France's most profitable export businesses, and its rituals had become a major tourist draw. Restaurant and cafe owners formed powerful lobbying groups, arguing that a ban would destroy their businesses and the entire Parisian night economy. Labor unions also opposed prohibition, seeing it as a threat to working-class jobs. The crisis also had a significant international dimension. Belgium had implemented strict quality controls, while Germany had used high taxes to discourage use, and Italy had classified absinthe as a controlled pharmaceutical. These different approaches provided valuable data, suggesting that a total ban might not be necessary. However, the political momentum for prohibition was building. The spring of 1907 brought a series of events that seemed to prove that a moderate approach was insufficient. The most shocking was the Du Bois family massacre in Lyon, where a respected craftsman killed his wife, 3 children, and 2 neighbors during an absinthe-fueled rampage. His rapid transformation from a model citizen to a mass murderer confirmed the worst fears about the substance. The case became a major turning point, with even moderate voices calling for an immediate ban. Religious leaders joined the chorus, framing absinthe as a threat to Christian civilization. Dr. Pierre Janet's research at the Salpêtrière Hospital provided new and compelling evidence. He found that chronic absinthe users showed permanent changes in brain structure that persisted long after they stopped drinking. These findings were the strongest scientific justification yet for a ban, as they indicated that even moderate use could cause cumulative brain damage that was difficult to reverse. The French government was now caught between undeniable scientific evidence and powerful cultural and economic forces. The complexity of the issue was made worse by the fact that much of the absinthe on the market was a toxic counterfeit, which added another layer of urgency to the call for a ban. The medical community's understanding of absinthe reached a terrifying new level in 1908. Dr. Charles Richet, a prominent French physiologist who would later win the Nobel Prize, presented brain tissue samples from chronic absinthe users that showed cellular destruction unlike anything ever seen. Under a powerful microscope, the tissue appeared to be a veritable wasteland. Neurons in key areas of the brain, the frontal cortex and hippocampus, regions responsible for reality testing, judgment, emotional control, and memory, had literally dissolved, leaving behind tiny, empty holes. What made this discovery so compelling was that the damage was concentrated in these specific areas, a hallmark of absinthism that was not seen in cases of traditional alcoholism. When Richet projected enlarged photographs of the damaged tissue at a major medical conference, it became impossible for even the most skeptical observer to deny the physical reality of what absinthe was doing to human minds. It was a visible, horrifying form of neurological suicide. These medical findings coincided with a dramatic rise in absinthe-fueled public violence that confirmed the worst fears. The winter of 1908 saw a surge of bizarre and brutal crimes that captivated the public's horrified imagination. The case that finally broke the public's tolerance involved Dr. Henri Moreau, a highly respected surgeon at the prestigious Hôpital Petit-Salpêtrière. Moreau had been secretly struggling with a severe absinthe addiction for nearly 2 years, a habit he hid from his colleagues and family. On October 12th, while performing a routine surgical procedure on a wealthy banker, Moreau suffered a complete psychotic break. He became convinced that his patient's internal organs were infested with supernatural parasites that only he could see, parasites he claimed were part of a vast, unseen conspiracy to corrupt Paris from within. He began operating with a frantic intensity, no longer using surgical precision but rather a wild, almost ritualistic fervor, claiming he was saving the patient's soul from demonic possession. His surgical team watched in horror as he began to cause massive internal injuries that proved fatal. The operating room descended into chaos as nurses and assistants tried to restrain him. When police finally subdued Moreau, they found his personal quarters filled with elaborate diagrams mapping what he believed was a vast supernatural conspiracy that had infiltrated Paris through its water supply. The sheer horror of the case was that a man of such high intellect and skill, whose entire life was dedicated to the sanctity of human life, could be so completely lost to a delusional reality. The Moreau case was particularly devastating because it shattered the final illusion of immunity. The prevailing belief was that absinthe's most destructive effects were confined to the morally weak or the psychologically unstable, the bohemians and the poor. The idea that a respected physician, a man whose profession required the highest levels of cognitive precision and ethical responsibility, could be so completely corrupted by the substance terrified the upper classes. The medical community's response was swift and decisive. The French Medical Association held an emergency assembly where over 3,000 physicians voted unanimously for an immediate and complete ban on all absinthe production and distribution. Dr. Paul Bouardel, a prominent academic, declared in a scathing public statement that continued government inaction would make French authorities complicit in a mass poisoning of the population. Psychological autopsies of absinthe users who died during this period revealed brain damage that exceeded even the most pessimistic medical predictions. Dr. Émile Lemaire's team discovered that the neurological decay in chronic users was so extensive that some of their brains resembled those of individuals who had suffered massive strokes or severe traumatic injuries. The damage was accelerating at an exponential rate, making a swift ban the only way to prevent more catastrophe. The international medical community reacted with horror to these findings. The German pathologist Rudolf Virchow, a founder of modern medicine, published a now famous open letter declaring that absinthe represented the greatest neurological catastrophe in recorded history. British medical journals began referring to France as a nation in the grip of mass neurological suicide. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. The Paris Stock Exchange experienced its worst single-day decline in over 2 decades as international investors fled French securities. Foreign businesses began relocating their operations to other European cities, citing concerns about the reliability and safety of French workers. Insurance companies that had been gradually withdrawing from absinthe-related coverage now refused to provide any policies whatsoever to French businesses or individuals. Lloyd's of London announced that France had become uninsurable due to the unpredictable nature of absinthe-related incidents and the government's failure to address the crisis effectively. The tourism industry, which had been in decline for months, now faced complete collapse as foreign governments began issuing official travel warnings. The American State Department classified Paris as a dangerous destination comparable to regions experiencing active military conflict. The military implications of widespread absinthe use became a major national security concern. Medical exams of recruits revealed that a large number of young men had early signs of absinthism, making them unfit for service. General Ferdinand Foch warned the government that absinthe was a greater threat to French military readiness than any foreign enemy. The economic costs of absinthe were also beginning to outweigh any benefits. A comprehensive study revealed that the total social cost of absinthe consumption exceeded its economic benefits by nearly 10 to 1. The tourism industry, which had initially benefited from the mystique of Parisian absinthe culture, was now suffering. Foreign visitors were reluctant to travel to a city associated with substance-induced violence. The cultural debate intensified as French intellectuals were forced to confront the possibility that their celebrated artistic achievements were built on a foundation of systematic self-destruction. The year 1909 would be decisive. As political pressure reached a boiling point, all the scientific, economic, and social forces converged to force a final confrontation with the Green Fairy. The gathering storm of medical evidence, public outrage, and political pressure finally broke in the autumn of 1910. The week that medical historians would later dub the October Horror saw a terrifying and bizarre surge in absinthe-fueled violence. Paris, a city accustomed to street brawls and crimes of passion, was paralyzed by a string of 17 separate acts of violence, each more senseless and gruesome than the last, all linked to absinthe-induced psychosis. The city held its breath as each day brought another terrifying headline. A respected librarian in Montmartre, convinced that the books in his collection were whispering treasonous secrets to him, set his library ablaze. A market vendor in Les Halles, believing the vegetables had turned into living, writhing serpents, attacked his colleagues with a meat cleaver. A young couple, deeply in love, inexplicably turned on each other and began to fight in the middle of a crowded square, each accusing the other of being a disguised doppelganger sent to spy on them. The sheer, irrational brutality and public nature of these incidents, so unlike the usual drunken brawls, confirmed the public's worst fears. The most shocking and public case, a watershed moment that irrevocably turned public opinion, involved Dr. Henri Moreau, a highly respected surgeon at the prestigious Hôpital Petit-Salpêtrière. Moreau had been secretly struggling with a severe absinthe addiction for nearly 2 years, a habit he hid from his colleagues and family. He was, to all outward appearances, a paragon of his profession, a man whose steady hands and brilliant mind were trusted with the lives of the city's elite. On October 12th, while performing a routine appendectomy on a wealthy banker and philanthropist, Pierre Dubois, Moreau suffered a complete psychotic break. The operating room, normally a sanctuary of sterile calm and precision, descended into a scene of unspeakable horror. Moreau became convinced that his patient's internal organs were infested with supernatural parasites that only he could see, parasites he claimed were part of a vast, unseen conspiracy to corrupt Paris from within. He began operating with a frantic intensity, no longer using surgical precision but rather a wild, almost ritualistic fervor, claiming he was saving the patient's soul from demonic possession. His surgical team watched in horror and disbelief as he began to cause massive internal injuries that proved fatal. Nurses and assistants, initially frozen by the sheer audacity of his actions, finally moved to restrain him. The operating room descended into chaos as they struggled to wrest the surgical tools from the doctor's hands. When police finally subdued Moreau, they found his personal quarters filled with elaborate diagrams mapping what he believed was a vast supernatural conspiracy that had infiltrated Paris through its water supply. The sheer horror of the case was that a man of such high intellect and skill, whose entire life was dedicated to the sanctity of human life, could be so completely lost to a delusional reality. The Moreau case was particularly devastating because it shattered the final illusion of immunity. The prevailing belief was that absinthe's most destructive effects were confined to the morally weak or the psychologically unstable, the bohemians and the poor. The idea that a respected physician, a man whose profession required the highest levels of cognitive precision and ethical responsibility, could be so completely corrupted by the substance terrified the upper classes. His public trial became a morbid spectacle, with the courtroom packed with curious onlookers. Moreau sat in a state of profound detachment, convinced he was a national hero. His defense lawyer argued that his client was a victim of a toxic substance, not a criminal mind, but the prosecution countered that a man of such standing had a greater responsibility to control his habits. The medical community's response was swift and decisive. The French Medical Association held an emergency assembly where over 3,000 physicians voted unanimously for an immediate and complete ban on all absinthe production and distribution. Dr. Paul Bouardel, a prominent academic, declared in a scathing public statement that continued government inaction would make French authorities complicit in a mass poisoning of the population. Psychological autopsies of absinthe users who died during this period revealed brain damage that exceeded even the most pessimistic medical predictions. Dr. Émile Lemaire's team discovered that the neurological decay in chronic users was so extensive that some of their brains resembled those of individuals who had suffered massive strokes or severe traumatic injuries. The damage was accelerating at an exponential rate, making a swift ban the only way to prevent more catastrophe. The international medical community reacted with horror to these findings. The German pathologist Rudolf Virchow, a founder of modern medicine, published a now famous open letter declaring that absinthe represented the greatest neurological catastrophe in recorded history. He urged the international community to sever all scientific and medical ties with France until the government took decisive action. British medical journals began referring to France as a nation in the grip of mass neurological suicide. This international condemnation left the French government with no remaining diplomatic options. They could no longer dismiss the absinthe crisis as an internal matter. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. The Paris Stock Exchange experienced its worst single-day decline in over 2 decades as international investors fled French securities, particularly in the beverage and hospitality sectors. Foreign businesses began relocating their operations to other European cities, citing concerns about the reliability and safety of French workers. Insurance companies that had been gradually withdrawing from absinthe-related coverage now refused to provide any policies whatsoever to French businesses or individuals. Lloyd's of London announced that France had become uninsurable due to the unpredictable nature of absinthe-related incidents and the government's failure to address the crisis effectively. The tourism industry, which had been in decline for months, now faced complete collapse as foreign governments began issuing official travel warnings. The American State Department classified Paris as a dangerous destination comparable to regions experiencing active military conflict. The military implications of widespread absinthe use became a major national security concern. Medical exams of recruits revealed that a large number of young men had early signs of absinthism, making them unfit for service. The most common deficits were poor reaction time, extreme paranoia, and a profound inability to follow complex or multi-step orders. General Ferdinand Foch warned the government that absinthe was a greater threat to French military readiness than any foreign enemy. Intelligence reports confirmed that German military planners were indeed counting on French absinthe consumption to weaken their enemy from within. This strategic assessment transformed the debate from one of public health to one of national survival, a reality that forced even the most ardent absinthe supporters to reconsider their position. The prospect of defending French territory with an army composed largely of cognitively impaired soldiers was so terrifying that military commanders began privately discussing whether France should seek protective alliances with other powers rather than rely on its own defensive capabilities. The domestic political situation became increasingly unstable as public confidence in governmental competence reached historic lows. Riots broke out in several major cities as citizens demanded immediate action. The Socialist Party, which had previously opposed prohibition on the grounds of individual liberty, reversed its position after party leaders recognized that absinthe consumption was systematically destroying the working-class consciousness that was essential to their political movement. Conservative politicians who had resisted prohibition due to economic concerns now faced electoral annihilation as voters blamed them for the crisis. The Catholic vote, in particular, mobilized around prohibition as a moral imperative that transcended traditional political divisions. President Armand Fallier's administration lost all credibility, with foreign diplomats questioning whether the French government could even honor its international obligations. The cultural reckoning was equally devastating. The romantic mythology of absinthe-enhanced creativity collapsed under the weight of scientific evidence. Art critics began re-examining the masterpieces of the Belle Époque, finding that the greatest artistic achievements were created despite, rather than because of, absinthe consumption. The religious establishment's response reached new levels of militancy. Cardinal Amet of Paris delivered sermons describing absinthe as Satan's final assault on Christian civilization. The legal system's complete inability to process absinthe-related cases effectively had created a crisis of confidence in French jurisprudence. Courts were so backlogged with cases of diminished responsibility that ordinary criminal proceedings were being delayed for months or years. The educational crisis was reaching catastrophic proportions as teachers reported that increasing numbers of students were arriving at school with cognitive deficits, unable to comprehend basic mathematical concepts or remember historical facts. University administrators were documenting dramatic declines in academic performance that correlated directly with family histories of absinthe use. The scientific consensus was overwhelming, and continued government inaction was no longer an option. The momentum of public opinion and the stark reality of the national security threat had created an unstoppable tide. And so, the Green Fairy's reign of terror came to a final, tragic end. On August 28, 1914, just weeks before the outbreak of World War I, France finally banned absinthe completely. By then, the damage was incalculable. An entire generation had been cognitively crippled. Artistic communities were destroyed, and French culture was forever changed. The substance that had once symbolized Parisian sophistication became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing individual pleasure over collective survival. The final hammer fell on August 28, 1914, when the French government signed the complete and total prohibition of absinthe into law. The timing was a moment of chilling historical irony. Just 2 weeks earlier, Germany had declared war on France, plunging the continent into the abyss of World War I. The Green Fairy, which had once been a symbol of Bohemian liberation, was now seen as a national security threat that needed to be eradicated before the country could face its greatest military challenge. The ban was not just a piece of legislation, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. It marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a grim reckoning. The absinthe culture did not simply fade away. It was violently and abruptly torn out of the fabric of French society. The ban was met with a mix of relief, anger, and profound sadness. For many, it was an admission of a national failure, a public acknowledgement that the country had allowed a celebrated cultural icon to become a public health menace. For others, it was an overreach of governmental power, an attack on personal liberty and the artistic spirit. But in the face of an existential military threat, these philosophical debates became secondary to the raw, visceral need for a strong and unified nation. The immediate effect of the ban was a societal shockwave. The bustling, smoke-filled Parisian cafes that had been the epicenters of artistic and intellectual life for decades fell silent. Absinthe fountains were taken from public view, their spigots forever closed. The unique sound of water dripping onto a sugar cube, a sound that had defined l'heure verte for a generation, was replaced by an eerie quiet. Bartenders were left with overflowing stocks of the forbidden liquor, and distillers who had once run thriving businesses were now facing financial ruin. The powerful lobby of the wine industry, which had fought tirelessly for the ban, celebrated its victory, positioning wine as the wholesome, patriotic alternative. The artistic community, already reeling from the shock of the war, found itself untethered. The ritual that had provided so many with a creative scaffolding was gone, and many artists found themselves creatively adrift and psychologically unmoored. They had lost not just a crutch, but a perceived muse. The Great War, for all its horrors, became an unintended instrument of the absinthe purge. The very generation most affected by absinthe use was the same generation called to the front lines. Millions of young men, many of whom had been daily absinthe drinkers, were sent into the trenches. The war became a grim form of natural selection. Those with cognitive and physical impairments from absinthism were often the first to fall. For those who survived, the extreme physical and psychological stress of trench warfare completely subsumed any lingering dependencies. The psychological torment of combat replaced the need for hallucinogenic escapism. When the war finally ended, the absinthe culture, along with many of its adherents, was simply gone. Those who returned from the front found a nation that had little time or sympathy for the artistic and intellectual excesses of the pre-war era. The shared trauma of the war had forged a new kind of national identity, one that prioritized resilience, duty, and practical action over bohemian individualism. In the years following the war, the full extent of the damage became devastatingly clear. French hospitals and asylums were overwhelmed with a new and tragic type of patient. These were not the broken soldiers returning from the front, but the survivors of the Belle Époque who had escaped the war only to find themselves trapped in the permanent psychological prison of absinthism. Doctors began to officially document the long-term effects of chronic thujone poisoning, which they had only been able to observe in its early stages during the pre-war period. The medical community found that the most severe cases exhibited permanent neurological damage. Their brains had been literally rewired to a point of no return. Patients suffered from persistent, low-grade hallucinations that made it impossible to distinguish fantasy from reality. They had profound memory loss, were unable to form new memories, and exhibited thought patterns so disorganized that they could no longer form coherent sentences. The once brilliant minds of poets and painters were reduced to a state of perpetual confusion. Dr. André Levinson, a neurologist at the Salpêtrière Hospital, published a groundbreaking study in 1921 that chronicled the cognitive decline of over 200 former absinthe users. He found a chilling pattern of decay. First, a loss of abstract reasoning, then the dissolution of long-term memory, and finally, a descent into a catatonic state. His research was the first to show that the brain's ability to create and interpret symbols was a primary victim of absinthism. This explained why so many former artists could no longer produce work. Their minds had become a canvas upon which the hallucinations were permanently painted. In his concluding remarks, Levinson grimly declared that absinthe had created a new form of human, a being whose soul was permanently absent, its mind a ghost in its own home. The aphasia, the inability to speak or write, that afflicted many of his patients was particularly heartbreaking. These were men and women who had once commanded language with stunning brilliance, and now they could not articulate even the most basic thoughts. The artistic and literary community was haunted by this public reckoning, a mirror held up to their own past excesses. The social scars ran deep. The post-war generation looked at the absinthe era with a mix of horror and morbid fascination. The drink that had once symbolized freedom and intellectual sophistication was now seen as a national shame, a dark chapter in French history. The absinthe accessories that had once been priceless symbols of status were now sold for a pittance in antique shops, a physical reminder of a cultural madness. The bohemian quarters of Paris, which had once buzzed with absinthe-fueled intellectual debates, were now eerily quiet. A new, more sober form of intellectual life began to emerge, one based on realism and political action rather than artistic escapism. French society as a whole had become sobered not only by the war but by the grim reality of what had been lost. The artists and writers who had survived the era found themselves in a difficult position. They were seen as both tragic figures and as symbols of a failed experiment. Paul Valéry, a French poet who had witnessed the crisis firsthand, wrote in a letter to a friend that the absinthe era was a great lie, a false spring that promised life but delivered only death. He spoke for a generation of artists who had survived the long, slow, and public destruction of their peers. The great scientific mystery remained. How could a simple botanical extract cause such severe and specific neurological damage? It was not until the 1960s that the question was definitively answered. A new generation of neurologists and chemists, using advanced neuroimaging and gas chromatography, finally pinpointed the exact mechanism of thujone's action on the brain. They found that thujone is a potent antagonist of the brain's GABA receptors. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It acts as a brake, preventing neurons from firing too quickly and erratically. By blocking these receptors, thujone effectively removed the brain's internal braking system, causing a state of uncontrolled, hyperexcitatory neural activity. This created the hallucinations, the synesthesia, and the heightened sensory perception that artists had craved. But in the long term, this chronic state of overexcitation caused the very neurons to burn out and die, leading to the permanent brain damage that Dr. Richet and Dr. Levinson had observed a half-century earlier. The artists who thought they were unlocking their minds were, in fact, systematically destroying the very structures of consciousness itself. France, a nation with a deep history of artistry and intellectualism, was left with a painful truth. A generation of its most brilliant minds had been tragically sacrificed on the altar of a fashionable vice. The Absinthe era became a powerful cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of confusing creative inspiration with chemical delusion. The nation would spend decades trying to recover from this self-inflicted wound. The great minds that could have led the country out of the horrors of war and into a new golden age were either dead, crippled, or institutionalized, their genius extinguished by the Green Fairy. The memory of the Absinthe-era geniuses who succumbed to the drink became a grim monument to a tragic error in judgment, a stark reminder that even the most beautiful and celebrated cultural movements can harbor a dark and destructive core. The Great War ended not with a bang, but with a series of silent, pervasive sighs of grief and exhaustion. France, battered and bruised, began the long, agonizing process of rebuilding, but it was a recovery shadowed by an invisible national wound. The Absinthe ban of 1914 had been a desperate measure, an act of self-preservation enacted in the face of imminent invasion. But the prohibition had not erased the damage already done. It had merely stopped the hemorrhaging. The generation that had been raised on the Green Fairy was now entering its twilight years, and the full, horrifying extent of its permanent neurological and psychological damage was becoming a grim reality. The Belle Époque, once celebrated as a golden age of artistic and cultural brilliance, was now seen as a cautionary tale, a period of collective delusion. The most profound and lasting scar of the Absinthe crisis was not in the economy or the military, but in the human mind itself. French society was now living with a crippled generation, a cohort of artists, writers, and working-class citizens who were physically present but cognitively absent. In the 1920s, as the nation tried to find its footing, doctors in asylums and long-term care facilities were faced with an unprecedented and deeply unsettling caseload. These were not the broken-spirited victims of shell shock from the trenches, but men and women in their 40s and 50s whose minds had been systematically erased by a liquid poison. The symptoms, once a medical curiosity, were now an undeniable and tragic pathology. Patients exhibited a profound and irreversible form of neurological decay. Their brains, ravaged by years of thujone-induced hyperexcitatory neural activity, had suffered cellular death on a massive scale. The once brilliant minds of poets and painters were reduced to a state of perpetual confusion, their thoughts fragmented and their memories lost. The aphasia, the inability to speak or write, was one of the most heartbreaking consequences. Dr. Henri Dubois, a leading neurologist at the time, kept a detailed medical journal in which he chronicled the lives of his patients. He wrote of one former poet, once a master of language, who could now only produce a series of disjointed syllables. "His mind is a library," Du Bois wrote, "but the books have no pages, only covers." Another patient, a renowned painter, would spend hours staring at a blank canvas, his hand moving in a futile motion as if he were painting an invisible masterpiece. When asked what he was doing, he would only reply, "It is all in my head, but my hands cannot find the way." The medical community's research shifted from trying to understand how absinthe caused damage to understanding the irreversible nature of that damage. It was discovered that the frontal cortex and hippocampus, the two areas most affected by absinthism, were critical for abstract reasoning, judgment, and memory formation. Without these, even the most basic of daily tasks became a monumental challenge. The social stigma surrounding absinthism was pervasive and cruel. Unlike alcoholism, which was often viewed as a weakness of character, absinthism was a mark of a person who had willingly sacrificed their sanity for a fleeting high. The families of the afflicted would often keep their loved ones hidden from public view, a source of profound shame. The once celebrated bohemian lifestyle was now a source of public derision. The idea of the tortured artist, whose suffering produced great art, was replaced by the image of the ruined addict, whose self-inflicted madness produced only misery. This public condemnation was a direct result of a post-war society that valued practicality and survival over artistic self-indulgence. The younger generation, having witnessed the horrors of war and the mental decay of their parents' generation, saw the absinthe era not as a source of romantic inspiration, but as a cautionary tale of a society that had lost its way. The cultural and artistic landscape of France was forever changed. The artists who survived absinthism often found themselves creatively bankrupt. They could no longer produce the vibrant, groundbreaking work that had defined their early careers. The great works of the Belle Époque, the paintings, the poetry, the philosophical treatises, were now seen in a new, darker light. They were no longer viewed as pure expressions of genius, but as morbid artifacts of a chemically altered mind. Art critics began re-evaluating the work of the era, pointing to the telltale signs of neurological decay, the distorted perspectives, the repetitive motifs, and the bizarre, fantastical subject matter that had once been celebrated as a sign of artistic genius. The era's greatest art was now seen as a tragic symptom of a national disease. The next generation of artists, which would later become known as the Lost Generation, actively sought to distinguish themselves from their absinthe-addled predecessors. They turned away from the esoteric, dreamlike art of the Belle Époque and embraced a new kind of realism. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who flocked to Paris in the 1920s, were drawn to the city's intellectual life, but they were deeply aware of the ghosts of absinthism. Their work was often grounded in a raw, emotional honesty that was a direct reaction to the hallucinatory escapism of the previous era. They sought to find truth in the real world, in their own struggles with identity and purpose, not in a bottle of green liquor. The new café culture that emerged was more reserved and introspective. Intellectuals would gather not to experience a shared hallucinatory state, but to engage in sober, philosophical debates about the human condition. The long, ritualized absinthe ceremony was replaced by a quick espresso, a sign of a new, faster-paced world that had no time for self-destructive indulgence. The scientific legacy of the crisis was both tragic and invaluable. French medical schools became the world's leading experts on neuropharmacology, studying the long-term effects of thujone on the brain. The French government, in an act of profound and public contrition, created a National Institute for Brain and Cognitive Research, using the tragic absinthe experience as its foundational case study. Scientists, for the first time, were able to track a single psychoactive substance's effects on an entire population from start to finish. The findings from these studies became the basis for modern neurological research and laid the groundwork for the future of psychiatry. Researchers realized that the human brain was not a static organ, but a dynamic system that could be permanently rewired by chemical substances. This understanding would prove invaluable in treating everything from mental illness to traumatic brain injuries. The absinthe crisis left France with a profound sense of cultural loss. It had cost the nation not only a generation of its most brilliant minds but also its reputation for artistic and intellectual leadership. The Green Fairy, once a symbol of Parisian sophistication, became a ghost haunting the nation's collective memory, a phantom reminder of a cultural trauma that took decades to heal. The memory of the absinthe-era geniuses who succumbed to the drink became a grim monument to a tragic error in judgment, a stark reminder that even the most beautiful and celebrated cultural movements can harbor a dark and destructive core. The lingering scars were a permanent reminder that some wounds, once inflicted, can never truly be healed. The absinthe crisis, for all its horror, was not an isolated event but a grim harbinger of the modern age. It became a powerful cautionary tale, a brutal lesson in the unforeseen consequences of prioritizing a fleeting cultural trend over public health and scientific reason. The French government, intellectuals, and citizens who lived through the debacle were left with a series of profound and enduring scars, not just on the minds of a generation, but on the very fabric of society. The ban of 1914 was a symbolic and tragic admission of collective failure, but it also forced a long and painful self-reckoning that would ultimately redefine the relationship between art, science, and the state. The memory of the Belle Époque was forever tainted, its glittering brilliance now seen as a facade for a deep national psychosis. The most enduring legacy of the crisis was its monumental impact on the field of neuropharmacology. Before absinthe, the understanding of how a substance could fundamentally alter the human mind was primitive at best. Doctors believed that most psychoactive effects were simply a form of intensified drunkenness. The bizarre and consistent symptoms of absinthism, however, challenged this notion completely. The pioneering work of Dr. Magnan, Dr. Richet, and others, who meticulously documented the brain tissue of absinthe victims, laid the foundation for a new, more sophisticated understanding of the brain. For the first time, scientists had irrefutable evidence that a chemical compound could not only produce temporary hallucinations but could also cause permanent, structural damage to specific parts of the brain. The discovery that thujone was a GABA receptor antagonist, effectively removing the brain's brakes, was a watershed moment in the history of neuroscience. It proved that the brain was not a static organ but a dynamic, malleable system that could be permanently rewired by chemical substances. This understanding would prove invaluable in treating everything from mental illness to traumatic brain injuries and would lay the groundwork for the modern pharmaceutical industry's focus on targeted drug therapies. The French government, in an act of profound and public contrition, established a National Institute for Brain and Cognitive Research, using the absinthe experience as its foundational case study. This institution, initially formed to understand the damage done, became a world leader in its field, ensuring that the tragedy of the past would inform the science of the future. Culturally, the absinthe crisis left a deep and permanent mark. The romantic idea of the tortured, self-destructive artist, whose madness was a prerequisite for genius, was shattered. The beautiful, dreamlike paintings and the esoteric poetry of the Belle Époque were re-examined and seen not as products of pure inspiration, but as morbid artifacts of a chemically altered mind. Art critics began to point to the telltale signs of neurological decay in the work itself: the distorted perspectives, the repetitive motifs, and the bizarre subject matter that had once been celebrated as a sign of artistic genius were now viewed as tragic symptoms of a national disease. The generation of artists who followed, the lost generation, actively sought to distinguish themselves from their absinthe-addled predecessors. They turned away from the hallucinatory escapism of the Belle Époque and embraced a new kind of realism. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who flocked to Paris in the 1920s, were deeply aware of the ghosts of absinthism. Their work was grounded in a raw, emotional honesty that was a direct reaction to the fantastical, drug-fueled art of the previous era. They sought to find truth in the real world, in their own struggles with identity and purpose, not in a bottle of green liquor. The new café culture that emerged was more reserved and introspective. Intellectuals would gather not to experience a shared hallucinatory state, but to engage in sober, philosophical debates about the human condition. The long, ritualized absinthe ceremony was replaced by a quick espresso, a sign of a new, faster-paced world that had no time for self-destructive indulgence. The political and economic fallout also offered invaluable lessons. The absinthe crisis was a stark illustration of the dangers of allowing economic interests and cultural mythologies to override scientific consensus and public health. The powerful wine lobby's successful propaganda campaign against absinthe, while ethically dubious, was a masterclass in political maneuvering that would be studied for decades. But the ultimate victory of the prohibitionists came not from moral superiority, but from the undeniable social and economic costs. The military's fear of a crippled army and the economic collapse of the French insurance and tourism industries were the final, decisive blows. The crisis taught governments that inaction in the face of a public health crisis could lead to far more catastrophic economic and national security consequences down the line. It became a foundational case study for public policy, a powerful argument for proactive regulation and the prioritization of long-term social well-being over short-term economic gain. The French government, humbled by its public failure, began to enact stronger public health measures and to invest in scientific research as a means of preventing future crises. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the absinthe crisis is its startling relevance to the challenges of a new century. The same debate that consumed France in the 19th century, the tension between individual liberty and public health, the search for a chemical shortcut to creativity, the clash between cultural celebration and scientific understanding, is being reenacted today with new substances. The debate around psychedelics, for instance, echoes the early conversations about absinthe. Both were initially seen as a way to unlock creativity and a higher state of consciousness. While modern science is far more equipped to understand the potential benefits and risks, the human desire for a green fairy remains a powerful constant. The tragic human cost of the absinthe era serves as a grim warning. The memories of the artists, writers, and ordinary citizens whose minds were permanently erased by a fashionable vice became a grim monument to a tragic error in judgment. They are a permanent reminder that even the most beautiful and celebrated cultural movements can harbor a dark and destructive core, and that some wounds, once inflicted, can never truly be healed. The absinthe crisis, a century later, is a timeless tale of human folly, a stark reflection on the fragility of the mind and the enduring dangers of seeking magic where only science resides. It is a cautionary tale for all of us, reminding us that true inspiration comes not from a bottle, but from the wellspring of human resilience.